Hi again, and welcome back to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. I'm Stephen Downs. We're in Module 6, which is titled The Duty of Care. So as you can tell, it's kind of a core module for this course. We're a few presentations in. This presentation is on the concept of care and relationships. And it's an interesting one for me because as you may know, or you may not know, my own history in the field of online learning has a lot to do with connections. I'm associated with connectivism, and I talk a lot about the idea of knowledge being generated through the creation of and adjustment of connections, either in the brain between neural cells or in society between people. So there's obviously an overlap here between the concept of connection and the concept of relationships. Now, when I talk about it, I talk about connections as being defined by a change of state in one entity resulting in a change of state in another entity. So it's kind of a one-off, right? Relationships are different. Relationships involve the creation of an ongoing series of connections, and as a result, what we might call a bond or a deeper connection or something between the two entities in question. In the ethics of care, the entities in question are always people. Although, we could ask quite relevantly here, does your robot care? Does your AI algorithm care? And just as importantly, do you care for it? Or do you care for them, depending on pronouns? Depending on how you see your robot companion. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So what I want to do in this presentation is look at the concept of relationships from the perspective of the ethics of care. So we begin with a look at the concept of personal responsibility, which this is in the ethics of care to a large degree a reaction against. Harold Lasswell's succinct definition of politics from 1936 is essentially who gets what, when, and how. And in these days, we might also say where, especially in the days of home shopping. And instead, we could think of care as a way of dividing up responsibilities. Who is responsible for caring for what, where, when, and how. But I think it's a bit more than that. This is just the political perspective, but the main point here is personal responsibility or individual responsibility isn't sufficient, according to Toronto, for democracy, and isn't sufficient, therefore, for an ethic or an ethics of care. Toronto continues, accounts of responsibility stress its ties to the freedom of the subject to act and the consequences of such action, of assigning blame for past judgments and actions. And we can see that, right, in the accounts of consequentialism that we've already looked at, or even the accounts of social justice that we've looked at. It's not so much that it's backward looking, although that's part of it, but a lot of it has to do with assigning responsibility or blame. So the focus here is very much on the negative outcomes and preventing the negative outcomes. And I think there's a certain perspective on the world that has us looking at these negative outcomes. Toronto continues, feminists have begun to develop a model that is forward-looking and accounts for how to make change rather than simply to assign blame. Now, making change is a lot harder. It's a lot more problematic. You're dealing with opposition and criticism. And we're looking now, for example, in the United States, at the pushback to things like critical race theory and efforts to make changes in society as a whole, so that social institutions such as schools, police, healthcare, etc., are more equitable, and there is a pushback to that. That's a bit different from assigning responsibility for the failures, although there certainly has been an element of that. When your police department kills a black man, an unarmed black man, and does it from apparently racist motives, there's going to be a question of responsibility and blame, and quite rightly so. But it's more than just personal responsibility. It's more than just individualism that is at the core of an ethics of care, and that's what we're getting at here. We could say, indeed, that interdependence is a condition. It's a fact about reality rather than the result of a social contract or the result of an ideal. Again, it's just, you look at the world, you look at yourself, and you realize just by looking at it that we are interdependent. Now, we can cash out different ways of describing that and thinking of different ways things are interdependent. Just to draw out that idea, I've put in a diagram here of the interdependence of the energy system, the water system, the transport system, telecommunications, and emergency services, right? And you can see all of these things are interdependent. And it wouldn't make sense to talk about the management and administration of energy without talking about the management and administration of water, because the two are so intimately connected. And that flows through the economy. We've been seeing this during the current pandemic with respect to the supply chain issues. We've had some breakdowns in the supply chain. As a result, a lot of things that we need on a day-to-day basis to maintain ordinary infrastructure and services aren't available, and so there are shortages beginning to develop. Now, that doesn't need to be bad. We don't need to experience severe shortages to realize here the interdependence of all of these different factors in our economy. The conditions of a person working in Hong Kong, the health of a person piloting a ship in the South Pacific, the labor conditions of a person working unloading the docks in Vancouver, the ability of a truck driver to get gas to drive the content across the country, and then the availability of staff to work in the store where you buy the shirt. All of these are connected. Part of connectivism is that all of these connected and all of these connections represent knowledge. And we've talked about that quite a bit in the connectivist perspective. But all of these also have a bearing on the ethics of our practices. And that's what feminist ethics of care bring to the table. To recognize the inevitable interdependency essential to the existence of reliant and vulnerable beings, as Kittay and Feder say, and Engster say, I'm quoting here, de la Bella Casa. Interdependency is not a contract nor a moral ideal, it is a condition, as I said. Care is therefore necessary to the continuation of life for many living beings in more than human entanglements, not forced on them by a moral order, and not necessarily a rewarding obligation. It's just a fact. This interdependence is just a fact. And I think, I've talked a lot about that from a neural perspective as well. I've said things like, if you open up brains and you look at what you've got, all the goo and blood and such, you don't find sentences and pictures or models, you find neurons connected with each other, sending signals to each other. That's the fact of neurophysiology. And a lot of discussion about learning, teaching, thinking, consciousness is about how we interpret that fact. And what we're saying here is that this fact has not just a knowledge dimension, but also an ethical dimension. Now, what is the ethics of a neuron? I think that's an interesting question. It's a question that doesn't make sense so much talking about the ethics of a human neuron, but when we're talking about the ethics of a computer neuron, as in an AI system, now different considerations come into play, because unlike a human neuron, which is basically we have to use it as designed, we actually create computer neurons and we can affect that design. Noddings says, the living other is more important than any theory. This is the central idea in an ethic of care. It is pre-theoretical, rooted in natural caring. Now, we kind of need to pull out some of that, right? Because there are, again, different ways of interpreting what we mean by, say, natural caring. Because I don't think, I could be wrong here, but I don't think Noddings is giving us a naturalist theory of ethics here in the sense of nature is such and such a way, therefore it is good, right? What I think that she's saying here points more to the concreteness and the particularness of any particular interaction, any particular relation with another person. And what she's saying is, when you're related with another person, that relation is more important than the theory. That it's more immediate, it's more central. And when you're in an interaction with someone else, you are not typically evaluating that interaction on the basis of a theory. You're not running a mental calculation in your head, well, how much can I get out of this? Or how much happiness will be produced if I say such and such a thing? Or even, what is the virtue of my interaction with this person? Not quite saying it like that, right? So I think in natural caring, I think natural should be understood more in the terms of customary, habitual, ordinary, common, as opposed to this is the state of nature that we must follow. At least that's my feeling. People might interpret Noddings differently. Noddings might interpret Noddings differently. And again, who am I to explain her own thought to her? Anyhow, it does lead to the idea of what's called diminishment. And diminishment is the set of factors, basically, that interfere with that care. So, as Nodding says, when she either chooses or is forced to act in a way that rejects her internal call to care, people and organizations can deliberately or carelessly contribute to the diminishment of others' ethical ideals. The ethical ideal in this case being the ethics of care. By teaching people not to care, or by placing them in conditions that prevent them from being able to care. Couple of things happening here, right? First of all, the idea that a person has this internal call to care, whatever that is, but also the idea that this capacity to respond, to form this relationship, to provide care or be in a caring relationship, can be and is impacted by other elements in society. It's not simply that we're related to the person that we're caring for. It's also that we're related to a whole bunch of other people and other things which impact on our relationship. Our relationship with the person being cared for does not exist in a vacuum. But that relationship, and again, the fact of all of these other relationships, is more important, has more bearing on the ethical interpretation of the relationship than any theory. An institution diminishing your capacity to care, that reality isn't something that is subject necessarily to a theoretical analysis in terms of, say, consequentialism or social contract or whatever. Some people might say, well, it is subject to an analysis by critical theory. But the theory of critical theory is less important than the fact on the ground, to use that expression, of the relationship between you and that other person, you and your employer, you and the people around you. And again, that goes back all the way back to Carol Gilligan and the idea of where the ethics of care begins from in the first place. She says it starts from the premise that as humans, we are inherently relational, responsive beings, and the human condition is one of connectedness or interdependence. So rather than being based on a rational, argumentative calculation sort of logic, morality is grounded, she says, in a psychological logic, reflecting the ways in which we experience ourselves in relation to others. We're going to want to cash that out. I'm not going to want to take the cognitive psychologist line here of beliefs, desires, etc., etc. But I am going to want to take the experience line here, right? Our existence as beings is characterized by experiences. And among these experiences are the experience of ourselves in relation to others. And again, for each of us, that's more of a fact than an inference. We can get all philosophical and ask, what about the reality of other people out there? What about the reality of their mental states? But what's more immediate to us is our experience of ourselves in these relationships. And that's where the origins of morality arise. They arise in human relationships as they give rise to concerns about injustice and carelessness, right? Similarly, Noddings is saying the same sort of thing. Caring is, quote, rooted in receptivity, relatedness, and responsiveness, and describes that as a more basic and preferable approach to ethics. This is common across the writing of ethics of care. You won't see calculation, you won't see argumentation, you won't really see appeal to overarching theory, and despite some of the language that's used, you don't really see appeal to theories of human nature or theories of nature as it is. In other words, I think it would be a mistake to call ethics of care a naturalist moral theory, although it's based in what might be called a fact, a state of nature. Kind of, there's 6 1/2 dozen of the other here, and I am drawing a distinction between the two. But again, I think it's the felt or perceived or expressed relationship that's more important than a general description of what the state of nature is, what the nature of individual people are, etc. There's nature and there's nature. There's nature as the scientist sees it, or the pseudo-scientist sees it, as sets of laws of nature and abstractions and categories and natural kinds and all of that. And then there's nature as we experience, dirt and grease, or as Pink says, it's salty and sweaty. Uh, yes, I just quoted Pink. um, so given that, we can draw an account of how empathy and receptivity fail. Now, empathy and receptivity here, those refer to specific things, but I'm generalizing this a bit, and I would characterize this slide as describing more generally how relationships relationships fail. The relationship between doctor and patient, teacher and student, etc. We can look at these. I'll start from the left-hand side there. The understanding of the other person might be impacted by conforming, labeling, or categorization. On the other hand, it might be impacted by projection or quote-unquote mind reading. Both of these are cases of us imposing some kind of order or state of affairs or understanding of what their mental state must be, and therefore what their needs must be, based on labeling, based on mind reading, whatever. So there's that. As well, on the vertical axis here, we have empathetic receptivity, emotional contagion, and if I had to interpret that, which I do, I'd call that something like becoming so wrapped up in the emotions of the relationship that I lose sight of the relationship itself. It's the way a person can be overwhelmed by tragedy, for example, and thus be able to not be able to respond in a caring, helping way to the victims of that tragedy. On the other hand, we have basically the opposite of that. The loss of empathic responsiveness, the loss of responsiveness generally at all. Gossip, empty talk, changing the subject. Here, it's cases where you're just simply not impacted by whatever is happening on the other side, and your relationship with them becomes kind of pro forma, empty, right? Where you just don't stay on topic. You don't talk about anything meaningful or significant. There really is no emotional engagement with the other person. So these, we'll go back here and we look at the ways that we can diminish our moral capacity. We come back here and these are 4 mechanisms for the diminishment of that moral capacity vis-a-vis relationships. The ways in which our relations with the others as a source of ethical importance are diminished by actions that we can take, or maybe more accurately, the overall attitude or tone of the actions that we take. The relationship in teaching and caring generally is a relationship that depends on both sides, right? It's not enough just to say, I am in a relationship, I care. The other person has to agree, yes, we are in a relationship. Yes, this is a caring relationship. I've put in the image of a current movie, I Care a Lot. And the premise of that movie is that the person who, quote, cares a lot assumes trusteeship over elderly people and then proceeds to put them in institutions and relieve them of all of their wealth and possessions. And obviously gets her comeuppance in the movie, because otherwise, it would be a pretty bad movie and people wouldn't go to see it. But the general idea is there, right? You can't just say that you care, right? So we have noddings, right? It is not enough to hear a teacher's claim to care. Does the student recognize that he or she is cared for? Is the teacher thought by the student to be a caring teacher? It does not reside entirely in the attitude and intentions of the carer. We must ask about the effects on the cared for. If A claims to care for B, but B denies that A cares, then the relation between A and B is not one of caring. So it's a mutuality here. It's not asymmetric. Care doesn't simply flow like manna from the heavens. The connection needs to be there. And again, this is a deeper kind of relationship than you would get, say, in transactional distance theory from Moore, etc., where you're calling and responding. It's not a checksum kind of thing, and I think we need to be clear about that. By checksum, what I mean is this: in computer science and information theory, the idea is you send a message, but you would like to know if the message was correctly received. So the receiver takes the message, performs a calculation, creates what's called a checksum out of that, and sends that checksum back. If that checksum matches your checksum, then you understand that yes, the message was transferred correctly and has been received properly by the recipient. It's a pretty smart idea. And basically that's, to me, what Moore's transactional distance theory is, right? We're checking to make sure the teaching message was received correctly. That's what testing is about, right? Testing isn't about a relationship between teacher and student. Testing is checking to see if what I sent was received in the students in the same way that I sent it. It's a pretty mechanical kind of thing. But it's not a caring relation. It's not a relationship properly so called. So the inference here is that the caring aspect, which we've talked about, meeting the expressed needs of, in this case, the student, needs to be one such that if you asked the student whether the teacher is at the very least attempting to meet the expressed needs, has the teacher heard them? Has the teacher taken steps to respond to them? Has the teacher maybe related back to them what these needs are? If the student says yes, then a caring relationship exists. But if they say no, then you can't say that a caring relationship exists. Now, being careful here. I know that I've just mechanized the process, right? I've basically given an algorithm for how you might instantiate that in code. And I can imagine trying to build such a system with these checksums and balances. And I think that probably more, almost certainly more, is required in the definition of what a caring relationship looks like. But the question here that I would have is that description exhaustible in terms of other factors? In other words, can you describe it in terms of what was said, what was done, and what was exchanged, etc.? I don't want to say in behaviorist terms, because that's not what I mean, right? We need to be able to consider mental states here as well. But we want to be careful, I would think, not to make the caring relationship an irreducible in itself, because then there's no real way to tell whether one exists. So there needs to be a way that we can tell whether one exists. At least I would think so. But, I'm a prickly analytic who wants to look at things and how we know things happen and all of that. But, there is a sense here, even in noddings, of, being able to distinguish between a state where a caring relationship exists and a state where one doesn't resist. And presumably we can talk about the strengths of these relationships, and thereby bring it back into the sort of terms that we might use when we're talking in a connectivist sort of way. What are the aspects of this caring relationship? Well, for one thing, for noddings, it's attentive. There's an engrossment happening here. I'm not thinking about other things. I'm not paying attention to what my response will be before having finished listening to the other person. There's a nice little slide presentation. It's in Prezi that I linked to that covers the different aspects of this. There's it's a relation that is receptive to the quote, what the cared for is feeling and trying to express, right? So it's not simply me imposing my understanding of what their needs are and then trying to respond to that. I'm actually receptive to and listening to what they're trying to say to me. Keeping in mind they might be not very good at saying what they're trying to say to me. And it's not mechanical. It's not merely diagnostic. And especially, it's not measuring against some kind of ideal, right? We're not going about, trying to detect gaps that we would then fill. The needs of the other person aren't always based on gaps. They aren't always based on absences. Sometimes they are. Sometimes, what the carer needs is water, or the cared for needs is water. They're thirsty. That's a gap. And we could measure that against an ideal of being fully sated. But the thing here is, and what's important is that the need is created by the person saying, I'm thirsty, not by the gap or distance between their saturation with water and being fully saturated with water. You see the difference? And the other thing about the relationship, and we could say a lot more about this, is that the existence of the need and as it comes through the relationship moves and motivates the carer. And in the next video, we're going to talk a bit about that, how this creates a duty or a requirement for the carer and isn't just something that, could be observed. And again, we can draw the distinction here, right? A person might say, I'm just trying to think of something off the top of my head, and it's a little bit hard, but that's the fun of doing these live presentations. The person might say, I need chocolate. Now, generally, that's not going to create this urgency on the part of the other person to make sure that they go out and get chocolate for this person. Now, there are, again, no general rules, right? We can imagine conditions where it would. The person is dying and they just want to taste chocolate for one more time before they pass. And so they're looking up and they say, I need chocolate. And yeah, that's going to move and motivate the carer. But if it's your 13-year-old son saying, I need chocolate for the 14th time that day, not so much. Although you might begin to wonder just what is this infatuation with chocolate that he has. But still, not the same sort of thing at all, is it? And so that's a distinction between, and this is, that's a distinction between relationships that are just incidental and relationships that are caring relationships. And that ties back in an important way, I think, to the way we've talked about connectivism, right? It creates, it's a change in the state of one person, in this case, an expressed need, changing the state in the other person. It's not simply the fact that the message is sent, but it's the impact that the message has in the other person. And when it creates this urgency or motivation to respond, that's when it is an instance of a caring relation. And you think about this, right? Think about how would you construct something like that, and that's really hard to imagine. How do you create a sense of urgency and motivation in a system, shall we say, that in some contexts has a real urgent need to respond, but in another context, for the very same message, does not have an urgent need to respond. I can't think of general algorithmic principles, say, that could possibly do the job. I don't think any such could exist. The responsibilities that grow out of this urgency are what define the nature of the caring. So they grow out of the relationships, says Toronto, and their complex intertwining, which is the deep exchange of messages back and forth. And we can think of that on a practical level. A person sends a message to another person. And we look at the semantics of that message. What does that message say? We look at how that message is interpreted by the receiver. What do those words mean? What do they stand for? What kind of need is expressed, right? But over time, as you have a relation with another person, you develop not quite a private language, but almost like a shorthand. Give you an example, and anyone who's married will know something like this, right? If I see Andrea do this, she wants to go, all right? And that may create more or less urgency on my part, depending on the situation. And it might be a suggestion, it might be an indication that she's seen all she wants to see. It might be an indication that this is a bad spot and we really should be moving. Any of those things might be what she means. But the main point here is that as we have these hundreds, thousands of back and forth communications over time, I become more and more able to recognize what she means by a particular gesture or particular action. It's not an explicit code. We have never sat down and said, when you do this, that's what we mean. Although, you see that on TV a lot, right? You see them planning these things. Yeah, if I do this, that means we need to go. And then, later on for comic effect, right? I've seen that I forget where I've seen that. Maybe on Friends or something, or How I Met Your Mother. It's a staple of comedy shows. But the way it really develops is implicitly, tacitly, ineffably, as a consequence of this long-standing set of conversations back and forth. And so that, I think, is what Toronto and others are getting at here. The having of this ongoing relationship means that there's a deeper intertwining between the understandings of each other's intent when they say something, gesture something, indicate something, or whatever. And what you need is this kind of interaction. From Toronto again, some sort of relation, either presence, biological, historical, or institutional ties, or some other form of interaction exists in order to create a relation and thus a responsibility. Huge, important point. And the important point is this. This is not magic. This is not mind reading or intuition or anything like that. It is referring to actual existing things that create this interaction in order to create the relation, and then out of that relation flows that responsibility. But and now, and we'll talk about this more, the relation becomes more than just a case of understanding what the other person is saying. The fact of the relation creates the urgency on the part of the other person to respond. So it's more than just a semantical thing. It is also an emotional or motivational thing, and out of that springs the ethics, right? The ethics is you responding to the motivational or urgent sort of factor of that relationship. And that's why we can talk about the ethic being diminished by external sources, right? Again, me and my wife are at a party, my wife goes, but if somebody's in a conversation with me and actually holding my arm to keep my attention, that person is diminishing my capacity to respond to my wife. And if it was a situation of some urgency, where I felt, an ethical need to respond to the needs of my wife in that particular context, then my moral capacity would be diminished. These are all moral facts, and these facts are more important than the moral theory that gives us some kind of abstract sense of what's right and wrong. And in fact, it doesn't even make sense, does it, to talk about a social contract between me and my wife. It doesn't make sense to talk about a utilitarian characterization. Now, I'm using me and my wife as a proxy because that's a relationship I'm really aware of, right? But these kinds of relationships exist to more or less a degree between any pair or group of people in a society. Doctor, patient, teacher, student, garbage collector, homeowner. There's an ethical relationship there based on your interactions over time. And hopefully more than just you give them garbage, they take it away. There is more than that. And that's kind of what being ethical is too, is having these relationships actually create this urgency or motivation to act. A person who is more ethical is more likely to feel these more appropriately. I say more appropriately because you can go overboard, or you can respond in too little a way. I mean, what's the sweet spot there? So, to wrap up this, then, we could think of this in terms of something like a social connection model, and Iris Marion Young offers one of responsibility that argues that all agents who contribute by their actions to the structural process that produce injustice, and we'll bracket the word injustice and use that as a proxy for a whole bunch of bad things, have responsibilities to work to remedy those injustices. And I think there's a point to that. I commented yesterday about my responsibility with respect to the shirt that I was wearing. And today I traced the linkages between the working conditions of the person who created the shirt and the fact of me wearing it. There is that connection there. There is a kind of interactivity there. And the question is, to what degree does that create a sense of urgency or motivation to act on my part? And what should happen is, if I am able to perceive the expressed need with respect to injustice, working conditions, oppression, whatever, on the part of the people making that shirt, that connection coming back to me, however that comes back to me, should motivate in me a response to do something about that, to work to remedy that. And that's a tougher thing to argue, not because it's hard to argue that oppression should be remedied or injustice should be remedied. Kind of think most people would, but what we're evaluating here is the responsibility. And the responsibility is based on this feeling, this motivation, and I could say stuff, the standard response. So how do you detect that? How do you measure that? But I'm more interested in how does that get created? Because, a person making a shirt in Hong Kong is at a real distance from me. And my connection with that person is very tenuous at best. To be a little bit humorous, it's a thin thread. Okay, that was bad. If I actually went to Hong Kong and went to a factory and found that the working conditions really were oppressive and injustices were happening, then that would probably motivate me more to do something about it. And I think that what we would like is for my motivation to be the same in either case. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm pretty sure this is recognized by ethics of care theorists, is that the two things are they're gonna impact me differently. They're going to motivate me to respond differently, simply because it's a more tenuous relation. And that's where we draw some of these secondary responsibilities to try to increase the degree of relationality between ourselves and the people who produce the things that we use, so that we have a more direct sense of what their lives are like. And one more thing before I wrap up with this section. The idea here also that in our response, in perhaps more traditional moral theory, our response would be something like, well, I'm just not going to buy the shirt then, which sounds great. But then you have to look at the wider conditions, the wider context. If I stop buying this shirt and everybody stops buying this shirt, this person who is currently oppressed becomes even more oppressed, because now she has no means of earning a living, which is arguably worse than a poor means of earning a living. And it also affects the people who depend on her. Even if she's a child, people are almost certainly depending on her. It affects the people who are involved in that supply chain between there and here. It has an impact on the relationship between Canada and Hong Kong, and therefore by implication China. There are wider ripple effects. All of these contribute to the context here. So it might be, you take these things into account, and you might want to do something like pay more for the shirt, or or you might want to support local shirt industries, and try to find something else for people in Hong Kong to do. There aren't going to be any simple answers. And that's why it would be irresponsible to simply impose a solution. That's why it's important to listen to what that person said, which means establishing more of a direct connection between them and finding out what they express as their needs in that context. They just might need shorter working hours. Who knows, right? How can I predict, right? Or something. In some cases, it's just recognition for their work. So, instead of sweeping grand narratives addressing these injustices, it really is a case of working from injustice to injustice, person to person. And just as an aside, the same is true in learning, right? We can draw a direct parallel between the person in Hong Kong making my shirt and the student in my class, who also happens to live in Hong Kong, taking my class, right? And they might be taking my class in the context of some oppressive conditions. Maybe they've been forced to take my class. Sorry about that if you were, by the way. Whatever, right? And again, the same sort of discussion has to happen here. I'm not going to have a sweeping theory of improving social justice of online courses, even if I believe in improving the social justice of online courses, because what matters is this direct relationship between myself and that student. Finally, just to wrap up a loose end, it's not just Hong Kong, right? I've just picked Hong Kong as an example because it's a place that's distant and it's a place where some of my shirts are made. But I could be using examples, any sort of example, any interactive relationship that I have with people, energy production, weapons sales, water exports, grapefruit production. All of these things are things that affect me in one way or another, right? I don't sell weapons, but I work for governments that support industries I do. So, I'd be foolish to deny that I'm just disconnected from that. And it really is a matter of, all of these connections are part of the overall social justice impact that you have on the world. And, it's always a case of picking and choosing which ones you're going to focus on. And that's part of your job as an ethical agent. That's what you need to do. And again, and I'll say it again in the future, right? That's indeed even something that is felt rather than decided. And this is why sometimes we have discussions about your responsibilities to those more closely related to you than your responsibilities to those more distantly related to you. But even how you define these and even how you create these are the results of your own actions and not static and unchangeable. But they're all subject to this interpretation as to how important they are, how relevant they are, why you should focus your attention on this thing rather than that thing. I noticed, for example, in the nonprofit NGO community, typified by people like, say, Beth Cantor. No criticism of Beth Cantor is intended here. There's a lot of focus on Cambodia, and I sort of sit there and I wonder, well, why Cambodia? What made Cambodia so important to them? And now me, of course, I want to throw a calculation into it and say, well, Malawi is a much poorer country. Why aren't they interested in Malawi, right? And of course, there are all kinds of reasons why Cambodia and not Malawi. And I'm not making any criticisms here, and it would be inappropriate for me to just throw in this calculation and make that definitive of the decision. But it's important to recognize as carers, those of us who are carers, that we are making these decisions. Or decisions is the wrong word. We are making these calls. We are emphasizing some of these relationships more than others, and considering some of these more morally significant than others. Now, in the ethics of care, we're most likely to respond to conditions of oppression and injustice, etc. But in the practical world, forget I said that. But in our lived experience, that's better. Other factors above and beyond the severity of the injustice and oppression are also at play. Proximity is one, personal relationship is one, nationality could be one, depends on who you are, where you live, etc. And these all flavor and color your sense of moral responsibility to the people you're connected with. So, it's easy to say, injustice creates in the person a responsibility. But that's the kind of broad, sweep moral theory thinking that I think the ethics of care is responding directly against. It depends on a lot of things. And what really matters is the immediate connection you have with the other person and what the other person is saying and what response that brings up in you. And that's what, to me, the social connection model is about with respect to ethics. Okay, that's it. It's an hour on something that I thought would be a half-hour presentation. Oh well, that's life. And so I'll be back with more on the essence of the duty and the wider community. Until then, I'm Stephen Downs. This is Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care, Module 6, and I'll see you soon. Very soon.